In between stately court portraits and high society commissions, Spanish artist Francisco de Goya was attuned to life's darker side, channeling hair-raising occult phenomena and existential terrors. It's Goya's realest, rawest, and most fantastical images that tend to bewitch us the most, because whether they turn your head or turn your stomach, you just can't look away. This is Several Circles. It began with ecstatic paintings in the Rococo tradition, and it culminated in this infamous picture of wickedness and folly. The dizzying evolution of Francisco de Goya's art is a shock to the system, and a gripping expedition into the artist's psyche as he weathered the ills of sickness and war. Spain was in a slow but steady process of reform when Goya was born in 1746, and when King Charles III assumed the throne in 1759, he heralded a halcyon reprieve in Spanish history. It was the age of enlightenment throughout Europe, an era in which scientists pursued discovery and philosophers waxed poetic about liberty, religious tolerance, and the sovereignty of the individual, ruled more effectively by reason than by greedy, omnipotent monarchs. King Charles III was one of the so-called enlightened despots of Europe, who upheld select Enlightenment ideals so long as he maintained absolute power to implement them. So Goya came of age during this period of optimism for a healthier society that would actually represent its people. Given his humble origins, his father being a gilder and his mother hailing from a minor noble but impoverished family, it figures that Goya would eventually hang his hat on these progressive values. He was born in the teeny-tiny Spanish village of Fuendetodos and subsequently moved to the nearby city of Zaragoza. There, a 14-year-old Goya began his journey as an artist with a Baroque painter by the name of José Luzán. Following a 4-year apprenticeship, Goya relocated to Madrid, but after 2 unsuccessful attempts at winning a drawing competition, he departed for Italy, a rite of passage for artists in training who could afford the trip. And somehow he did. While documentation of his early years is scant, evidence links Goya to Rome circa 1770, and in 1771, he tried his hand at another competition in the Italian city of Parma. The local Academy of Fine Arts called for paintings of the military commander Hannibal on his odyssey across the Alps to Italy. Goya submitted a formidable history picture where strength and ethereality converge. He lost the competition, but his painting received an honorable mention, which helped him find work upon his return to Spain. Goya was granted his first notable commission for El Pilar Cathedral in Zaragoza. The project of decorating the cathedral's interior was shared with Francisco Baeu, a fellow native of Zaragoza, painter to King Charles III, and Goya's eventual brother-in-law, as he married Baeu's sister Josefa in 1773. Baeu would facilitate Goya's entry into Madrid's Royal Tapestry Factory the following year, and his first commission from the crown came via Anton Raphael Mengs, a celebrated German painter who worked at Spanish court. Over the next 2 decades, Goya manufactured more than 60 cartoons, or preliminary paintings, to be adapted into tapestries. But more importantly, Mengs directed Goya's attention to the work of Diego Velázquez. As the leading court painter during the Spanish Golden Age, Velázquez's portraits abounded in the royal collection, and Goya scrutinized his predecessor's mastery of detail and light. He proceeded to make a series of etchings after work by Velázquez, and in a way, this was his first step towards stripping painting of its pleasantries to expose the character essentials. Later in life, Goya named Velázquez as one of his most significant influences, alongside Rembrandt, Velázquez's Dutch contemporary. Surely made with reference to Velázquez's The Crucified Christ, Goya's Christ Crucified earned him ascent to the ranks of Academician of Merit at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid in 1780. In 1785, his painting caught the eye of King Charles III himself, and Goya was duly promoted to Deputy Director of Painting that same year. Come 1786, a 40-year-old Goya became an official painter to the king. At once elegant and exaggerated, fashionable and singular, his court portraits memorialize aristocrats, statesmen, and of course, the king himself, whose death in 1888 spelled disaster for Spain. The new King Charles IV assumed a stabilized nation, which he led into a long and complicated political maelstrom. It was a brutal epic that altered Goya and his art, which suddenly darkened in subject and tone, pervaded by his pessimism. All the promise of the Enlightenment was tragically dissipating. Of the many children Goya had with his wife, only one survived into adulthood. He contracted an illness that left him permanently deaf, and he was stricken by the death of his dearest friend, Martín Zapater. There have been whispers as to whether Goya and Zapater were in love, since the two exchanged copious letters expressing their shared affection amongst sketches, meditations, and other precious insight into Goya's proud and passionate disposition. Regardless of whether Goya's fondness for Zapater was romantic, the loss of his friend was devastating, so he manifested his anguish and anxiety in his art, as exemplified in Los Caprichos, or the Caprices. Composed of 80 aquatint etchings, a kind of shaded print that Goya helped popularize, it's a cutting critique of the true Spanish condition, plagued by ignorance, depravity, and rampant superstition, a subject matter that he would repeatedly revisit and expand upon in paint and future prints. The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters is probably the most iconic plate in the series. A swarm of creatures stalks a sleeping man, who some historians believe is Goya himself. The image can be deciphered in more than one way, that when reason is asleep, the monsters come out, or maybe Goya was alluding to a more urgent happening, by which the dream of reason yielded monstrous results. The Enlightenment backfired spectacularly in France, where influential thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire disseminated the virtues of free will and constitutional governments that operate in the interests of the people. But the people were utterly destitute, thanks in large part to the crown's gross overspending on indulgences and war. From Paris to the countryside, civilians united with a laser focus on glassing the monarchy once and for all. The French Revolution raged from 1789 to 1799, ending with Napoleon Bonaparte's self-appointment as the nation's commander-in-chief. In Spain, the advancements enacted by Charles III were systematically collapsing under Charles IV. He was indecisive and indifferent, which we can subtly detect in Goya's royal family portrait, painted in 1800. Front and center is not the king, but Queen Maria Luisa, perhaps to suggest, with the utmost discretion, that she was the more active head of state. Reminiscent of Las Meninas, or Maids of Honor, Velázquez's venerated painting of the angelic Princess Margarita being fussed over by her attendants, Goya presents his own self-portrait with a rather motley crew. It's commonly perceived that he purposefully unflattered them and buried sly jabs in his royal commissions to express his discontentment with the current regime. But in 1799, Goya was given the most prestigious title of first chamber painter to the king, and it's unlikely that he would have done anything to compromise his post. Instead, we might read this painting as an unusually unidealized picture of royalty. While he captures their clothing and jewelry with maximum grandeur, the royals themselves are a flawed cast of distinctly human characters, not untouchable deities, and they weren't. Unbeknownst to the king, his days on the throne were numbered. He made foolish political decisions and elevated the wrong people to high stations, namely his prime minister, Manuel de Godoy, who's believed to have commissioned from Goya the first major, purely aesthetic portrayal of a nude woman. A scandalous move for the time, if that tells us anything. She's known as the naked maja, the term maja referring to lower-class beauties who flaunt their immodesty. Goya painted a clothed counterpart some years later, and she's no less tantalizing. One theory suggests that she's the Duchess of Alba, Goya's rumored mistress. Another postulates that she's Godoy's mistress, Pepita Tudó. But Godoy's eye for the risque was the least of Spain's worries. He forged shifting and self-serving alliances with so little finesse that King Charles IV was made to abdicate the throne, and the both of them became Napoleon's prisoners when his army invaded Spain in 1808. Charles's son Ferdinand was briefly made king before Napoleon removed him to install his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, and the people revolted in droves. Goya preserved the carnage in two gut-wrenching paintings. The 2nd of May, 1808 depicts the uprising in Madrid against Turkish soldiers in Napoleon's army who came to drag Ferdinand off to France. The 3rd of May, 1808 excruciatingly suspends a moment of the consequences when French troops gathered the Spanish rebels and shot them in cold blood. The paintings were created for the Spanish government as supposed tributes to Spanish bravery and heroism, but what Goya delivered was a sly anti-war masterpiece. Some say this painting marks Goya's pioneering pivot from old master to modernist because he stretched the limits of what art up until that point had even attempted to evoke in the viewer. This is not a glorious battle between warriors of equal match. It's an emphatically empathetic image that bleeds despair. It epitomizes Goya's vision of Romanticism, a cultural movement that rejected the Enlightenment's call for reason in favor of emphasizing emotional intensity, because while Goya was sympathetic to Enlightenment ideals, there was nothing remotely reasonable about this. The May Rebellions became part of the Peninsular War, a 6-year fight against French occupation of the Iberian Peninsula. The events plunged Goya into despondency, which he probed to make the disasters of war. Haunting, dreadful, and cautionary, it's a screaming protest against the barbarism of warfare. Goya worked on the series in private between 1810 and 1820, and he ultimately kept it under wraps, most likely for fear of the repercussions. His controversial Maja had already landed him in hot water with the Spanish Inquisition, so he never published the disasters of war. The prince would remain hidden until 35 years after his death. He had likewise pulled his brazenly satirical Los Caprichos from the market. King Ferdinand VII was restored to the throne upon French expulsion at the end of the war, and Goya, who had pledged his allegiance to Joseph Bonaparte, painted several portraits of the rightful monarch in an attempt to win his good graces. The extent to which Goya sincerely supported Bonaparte is unclear, and his paintings of the insurrection could be read as his move to demonstrate his true loyalty to Spain. Ferdinand pardoned Goya and even continued his salary, but he never commissioned anything from him, so Goya retreated from public life and created of his own accord. In 1819, Goya became severely ill, his narrow recovery prompting an outpour of delightfully deranged caricatures. They're known as the Black Paintings, a series of 14 frescoes painted on the walls of Goya's house on the outskirts of Madrid. Goya was elderly, widowed, and completely ensconced in silence, so these paintings are like private ramblings in his very own confessional. A poor little dog is soon to be swallowed by a sandstorm-like oblivion. Giant men fight with their legs curiously rooted in the earth, and a giant woman, possibly Goya's late-life companion, Leocadia Weiss, looms large against a strange backdrop. Distressed figures pay pilgrimage en masse, cavort with dark forces, and eat their young. It's an animalistic, cannibalistic image so vile that it's made its way into the public consciousness far and wide. Goya never spoke of or wrote about the Black Paintings as far as we know, so their titles and translations are conjecture, but this one is generally thought to be Saturn devouring one of his sons. A prophecy foretold the mythological Saturn that one of his sons would overthrow him, which he didn't take lightly because he did the same to his father. So in a strategic attempt to change his fate, Saturn ate his children as they were born. Of course, one escaped and eventually vanquished him, thereby completing the prophecy. If this really is a picture of Saturn's unholy feast, Goya wasn't the first artist to try his hand at it, but his depiction is uniquely grim, not only for the nauseating body horror, but for the frantic, shameful look in his eyes, bulging with desperation as if to say, I don't want to do this, but I have to. It's a lesson about the invincible will of power and the inconceivable lengths we'll go to in order to keep it, a mournful truth that Goya knew too well, especially in his twilight years. During the French occupation of Spain, a constitution was drafted to significantly check the monarchy, and when Ferdinand VII was reinstated, he agreed to the terms and conditions of said constitution, which he promptly disregarded. A military coup in 1820 established a hopeful 3-year period of national rehabilitation, but a power-mad Ferdinand came back in 1823 to crush the opposition for good and re-establish an absolute monarchy. He arrested whomever he perceived as a threat, exiling some and executing many others. He was strangely kind to Goya, whom he allegedly told, "You deserve to be garroted, but you are a great artist, so we forgive you." He even granted Goya leave to go to France for reasons pertaining to his poor health, but in 1824, Goya went into self-imposed exile instead to live out his final years in search of peace. A community of Spanish liberals developed in the French city of Bordeaux, where Goya settled. His new environment seems to have agreed with him. He was revived by good company, artistic experimentation, and time spent in Paris. He painted his friends, played around with miniatures, and the printing technique of lithography, and vigorously sketched his surroundings. Drawing was a mobile medium that allowed him to spontaneously capture what he saw, either as he imagined it or witnessed it on the streets. His late drawings are positively animated, alight with the flicker of an old and weary life anew. Goya continued to work until he died, age 82, in 1828. We have a lot to thank Goya for besides his own creations. He deeply inspired the likes of early modernist painter Edouard Manet, as well as his fellow Spaniards, Pablo Picasso and Salvador Dalí. Goya is rightfully canonized as the last of the Old Masters, the final addition to the Old World pantheon where he's commemorated next to his own muses, and yet there's something so relatable about his work, especially in times of crisis. His art is an inconclusive investigation into what compels the human race to repeat our mistakes, succumb to our weaknesses, and to senselessly wield suffering through the generations. His subjects are long gone, and some never even existed, but we can still connect with their pain, their abandonment, and their worry, which means we're not alone in ours. Thanks for watching Several Circles. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about the lives and work of extraordinary artists from across history and the present day, and let us know in the comments if there's an artist you'd like to know more about.